The Middle Ages, as I've said, was a very, very long period. It lasted about 900 years, from about 600 AD to about 1500. And that little closing date is chosen for convenience, really, because, as you might remember, it was in 1517 that Luther published his theses, and sometimes that's taken to be the end of the end of that of the period. So, change was very continuous throughout this whole period of time, and as we saw last week, changes to liturgy and liturgical practice and worship practice changed more rapidly in some areas than they did in others. And what you've got here is a timeline map of the Muslim conquests of parts of the Mediterranean world and further afield that had been Christian. And even though the churches in North Africa and Spain, as you can see, came under Muslim rule during this time that we're calling the medieval period, this didn't actually mean that the Christian world shrank in size, because when the south was blocked, Christianity expanded north to Iceland, to Scotland, these great missionaries of that Celtic period that is not the medieval period, it's before the medieval period. It expanded to the north, and it expanded to the east. So Iceland was converted in this period, as was Greenland. This is surviving Norse church in Valsey in Greenland. The church expanded also into Scandinavia. Here's a bishop carrying a cross dating from, I think, the late 1000s. It's the Skane Stone in Sweden. I remember there was a time when people didn't think that the Vikings had become Christians. They were just raping and pillaging and looting and plundering about. But I was on an archaeological dig in the Orkney Islands. There was a little Viking village right down by the beach, and we discovered a Viking cross from a very, very early period. It's one of the only ones known. It's a fascinating story. So it was in this period too that Christianity spread not just to the Scandinavian countries, but also across into Russia. Here are a group of, it's very romantic painting, but it's obviously not taken sur le vif, of a group of Christians worshipping in pagan Kiev. So Christianity expanded into the Russias during this period as well. Ukraine, Russia, Poland, the Eastern Slavic principalities. So Western and Eastern Christendom split in this period too, in 1054, with what is normally called the Great Schism, when the Church of the East separated from the Church of the West, the Orthodox Church from the Catholic Church. And Constantinople eventually fell. Here's Constantinople down here. Eventually fell 400 years later after the Great Schism. Constantinople fell in 1453. But by the very end of this period, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and Christianity spread onto the shores of the American civilizations too, and spread west. It's also, and people tend to forget this for some reason, it's a period in which Christianity, the roots of Protestant Christianity, Protestant worship and liturgy can be found in this period. It's not as if Protestants suddenly reinvented worship in the Reformation. Protestants sometimes kept aspects of medieval Christian worship that the Baroque Roman Church afterwards threw overboard. Things like penitential piety about the Eucharist is one of the examples. The diversity of Protestant worship in all its different forms in different parts of this Mediterranean world and further afield, which Rome tried to suppress after the Reformation, was kept alive in Protestant churches in very interesting ways. In England, for instance, Cranmer mentions that there are more than 5 rites going on of Christian worship in different parts of the country for Holy Communion. So first, a little bit of a background about the medieval period. there's penitential piety in the medieval period that carried on in the individual piety of the Reformation. We often look at the medieval period through rose-coloured spectacles. Jolly friars, and as you can see up here on the top left, and all Merry England, we're calling it, and the wonderful period in France of the height of medieval civilization. People tend to romanticize it a little bit. But medieval life for the majority of people was not a picnic in the park, to say the least. Poor nutrition meant that life expectancy was halved from what it was in the classical period. And even the size of the body shrank in this particular period, which you can tell from archaeological digs. Down there in the bottom, one of the great periods of medieval famine, there was a period in the 1300s, late 1200s, of slight climate change, which caused some failures of crops and things. So you can see it's a very varied period, and certainly not an enormously happy one in many ways. People lived in modest-sized villages, which also here we go, a little bit of little medieval people at the deathbed of somebody who's clearly not having a very nice time, and neither is his family. We tend to romanticize these medieval villages too. See, how wouldn't it be lovely to live there? How nice that would be, little pots of geraniums, carrying your baguette up the stairs, and waving to your neighbours through the window. This very different picture in the medieval period. You can imagine the chamber pots being emptied out of the upstairs windows, the close quarters when health conditions weren't really that fantastic, no running water. Once again, very often these very pretty villages have been prettified, and they've given us a funny idea of what life in the medieval period must have actually been like. Even the big cities were quite tiny by modern standards. Liturgical life was basically in these tiny parish churches, and not in the great medieval cathedrals that we imagine. It's centred on these small parish churches. You can see this one in France on the right-hand side. It was served by maybe one priest, two priests at the very most, and several men who might be in lesser orders, monks of one sort or another. And in the later period, many of these priests would be very badly educated indeed, hardly have any education at all, and would simply follow the books and homily books, which we'll see in a little minute. Very interesting, north of the Alps, the dioceses were huge. I don't know if you can see on this particular picture. Look at Italy. Those are the dioceses in Italy. All that scribbly little borders. And look at north of Italy. Look at what is covered now by, say, Poland and just here. How on earth could one bishop possibly go to all the churches in that particular area? This is going to become important in a minute. You can see England itself is just divided into three provinces, really. The diocese came a little bit later, but in the very earliest period, you can see that the number of dioceses in Italy vastly outnumbered the number of dioceses in the rest of Europe at this particular period, in the very earliest part of it. So you would be very lucky to come across a bishop at all. Maybe you would like to travel back to that time, sometimes, given some bishops. But we won't say any more about that.
The Episcopal Church solved the problem.
Yes, the Episcopal Church solved the problem, I suppose. It's called the Episcopal Church because most of them are bishops. And got one diocese for the whole area. Yes, that's right. So there was also a great deal of civil turmoil in this period. Here you can see where the Vikings went. At one particular period there, you can see in the eastern part of England came under the Dane law at one time, and the Danes were not Christians. They came over, they sacked Whitby Abbey and various other centres of monastic life in northeastern England. They came all the way through here. The Isle of Man here still has some sort of Viking government that it operates under. So at the very beginning of the period, you had all of these Norse invasions that disturbed everything. That gave way to the massive organisation of Europe around the Crusades, to the east in the middle part of this period. And at the very end of this period, you have the rise of nationalism and wars of one sort or another. So this 900 years, though it's long, it is characterised by a lot of turmoil. And the reason I wanted to emphasise that, also at the end of the middle of this period, the Black Death happened. This is a mass plague grave in London. When they extended the Jubilee line in London, the subway line, they came across several of these mass plague graves as they were building the subway. So the Black Death really meant that many villages were wiped out all across Europe, and they never recovered. In the middle of all of this turmoil, monastic life became a haven for people. This is Cluny reconstruction of what it might have looked like. It became an important centre of social stability in the medieval period. The Benedictine order, the Cluniac order, the Cistercian monasteries, at the very beginning, as we saw in our course on Christian spirituality, provided this sort of consistent haven for a lot of spiritual and intellectual and worship life of liturgy of the century. Last week we mentioned also the centrality of word to Christian worship, how Christians valued the word and literacy because their letters, their Bible and everything else were in that particular form. And these monasteries, like Cluny here, had these vast scriptoria where the monks would write down not only the Bible but the works of the early church fathers, about the collections of the rites of the Mass, about homilies that were being written at the time. So we can see how that tradition was handed down in these monasteries. But the prime occupation of a monk was going to be worship, and the monks were the ones who set the agenda for how worship or liturgy was viewed in the medieval period. We probably already know a little bit about their impact on the daily office, but they also made a huge contribution to church music. You can see here a group of monks, the Ludi choir books. This is towards the end of our period. See the conductor there with his magic wand. It's not as if everybody had a book, and we're going to discover how this works in a little minute. People would learn it by heart, and the one big book, one of the reasons the books were so big was that several people had to look at them at the same time to be able to follow what was going on, especially if you were a novice and had just entered in and weren't really quite sure what you were doing. So this huge contribution to church music was made by the monks as well. Church architecture came under their influence, the influence of the monastic orders. The design of churches built for monastic worship influenced everything from huge cathedrals all the way to little parish churches. So here you can see an example of a medieval antiphonal showing the line of the music. Very often they were very richly endowed, and so that they could afford to put gold leaf and all of the rest on of them, and there would be one or two of these for a monastery for the people who were on either side of an aisle singing these things antiphonally. So most of the liturgical changes in the Middle Ages flow from these religious orders. This is Salisbury Cathedral in England, and as you go up, what we're looking at here is right up towards the high altar, which is at the far end of the picture, but before you get to the high altar you get the choir, and you will notice that the benches here are arranged facing each other. And this is a result of the monastic orders. When you go into many, many churches, St. Bartholomew's Church, St. James's Church, you will see that the chancel, the choir, is always arranged in this fashion, and this is thanks to medieval monks who sang the psalms antiphonally In other words, this side would do one verse and then this side would do another verse, back and forth, and this is precisely the reason why churches are arranged in this way even today. Even if churches don't have a big choir anymore, say, this is the impact of the religious orders on church architecture. Also, the medieval university developed out of this period. This is Oxford University, founded because Henry II in England forbade English people to go to the Sorbonne. So, for Joris, we have a picture of the Sorbonne as well, right here. So these medieval universities were founded at the height of this period in the 1000s, 1100s. What the Sorbonne must be, what, 10 something or other? Early 1100s officially?
Yes, and then it was granted some charters by the Pope.
By the Pope. I think the same thing happened in England.
I think it's 1215, the charter.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the same for Oxford. There were groups of people gathered there in the 1000s, but they weren't officially recognised or given a permission until a bit later on. Now, these scholastic theologians that got together in these great universities did a lot to shape what Christians actually experienced in their liturgy, in their worship. They developed these very sophisticated definitions of the sacraments, for instance, and they tended to reduce them to these intellectual categories rather than the sort of awesome mysteries that they'd been considered in the earlier period, especially in the period that we were looking at last time. It seems a million miles away, their discussions about what sacraments are and what they're for, and discussions about transubstantiation and all of the rest of it. Seems a million miles away from these community meals that people gathered together to have, or the way in which the communion was celebrated in the period that we looked at last week, which still had some sort of relationship to those very early Christian periods. Roman ways of worship were very widely imitated, in fact. Not because Rome said you've got to do everything our way. You may know about the medieval pilgrimages. These are the great pilgrimage routes of the medieval period, many of them leading over here to Santiago de Compostela, but down here also to Rome, a great centre of pilgrimage. So people would go on these pilgrimages, and then when they returned home, much like, people showing their holiday slides to you today, they would say, oh, you must go to Rome, they do things so nicely there and so properly. Why can't we do that in Rouen? Imitate the great centre of the burial place of the greatest Christian martyrs of Peter and Paul. We should, they'd gone and they'd watched these great papal ceremonials associated with those places and took them back home with them and wanted their own churches to do the same thing. Now, Charlemagne, who was centred up here, around this sort of area, Aachen. Here we go. Here's his throne, his palace up here in Aachen. Charlemagne wanted to unite his empire, and one of the ways he tried to do it was to impose the same liturgy on everybody, to try and get some coherence in the empire. But attempts, this is in the 800s, but attempts by him and by popes actually to impose this universal liturgical practice were so difficult to enforce. They got the idea, of course, they wanted to use it as a power move to bring everybody together, but as I said last week, liturgy is messy. It doesn't lend itself to that sort of control. It always escapes it. We'll see that a little bit in the medieval period as well, in private popular devotion and in local devotion. And of course, one of the things that made it really hard to impose the same liturgy on everybody was that you had to use books like the ones we just saw. There was no printing press, there was no internet at the time. You couldn't do it. You'd have to produce thousands of liturgical books, all the same, and distribute them to all of these centres and small parish churches to have it succeed. So liturgy is always the people's business in that way, and to have some, I know we do this in the Episcopal Church with the Book of Common Prayer and all of the rest of it, but we do develop our own local little traditions around all of these things. Liturgy is not a good tool to use to impose uniformity on people, because it's always going to develop in particular unique ways in different places. So in the absence of a printing press, impossible to do. Let's look at baptism for a minute. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is what you're looking at here, in the medieval period, Christian initiation was a very tightly organised affair, and it went like this. At 8 days old, the child was named officially, given a Christian name. At 40 days old, interesting figure there, 40 days, the child was named a catechumen and exorcised using water and oil, then washed in the water of baptism, which is what you can see going on here at this particular point. The infant then received communion. The baby would only be given wine at this stage rather than the solid food of the host. I don't know if I've got a picture of that. Yes, here we go. So in the Eastern Orthodox Church, as soon as you were baptized, you would receive communion at 40 days old. And the whole rite here, from beginning to end, is carried out by a priest or a bishop. But the bishop is not necessary for baptism, confirmation, and first communion, Eucharist. In the Western Church, though, things were a little bit more messy. This is the evidence that we've got from this Galatian sacramentary. In the Western Church, initiation, baptism, communion, baptism, confirmation, first communion, was split into different parts, 3 occasions. Sometimes these occasions would be separated by years, and they would involve several orders of ministers. So a deacon or a layperson would perform the baptism sometimes. Then a priest would do a bit of preparation or what have you, and then a bishop became necessary to do the confirmation before you could have your first communion. So in the earliest period that we're looking at, in the 600s, the process looks a little bit like what happened in the East there, the order that we saw there. Baptism was still firmly associated with Easter and with Pentecost, and so the candidates were mostly infants at that period as well. So in the 600s, the candidate would be examined and exorcised, the water would be blessed, the child would be baptized, after which a bishop, if possible, say in Italy, where there were more bishops knocking around, would lay hands on them, and the whole thing would be rounded off with a mass with communion, where the baby would be given the wine, in the Western Church as well. But by the end of the Middle Ages, the integrity of the rite, all of these bits coming together, had all fallen apart. So the priest would perform the baptism, but the second part of the rite, anointing, laying on of hands, communion, was postponed until much later. There were exceptions. So here you can see in these little medieval pictures, the bishop, looking rather grumpy, I would say, in both of these pictures, is laying on hands and anointing these older children. There were different documents saying they had to be 7 before they were confirmed and allowed to have their first communion. Sometimes the documents say 12 years old. So these people here in the picture are 7 or 12 years old, being confirmed by the bishop. This never happened in the Eastern Orthodox Church. The rite never fell apart in the Eastern Orthodox Church. It remained stuck together. There is one exception, a famous exception to this, and that's Elizabeth I, the Queen of England. There's her robe. She was baptized, confirmed and given communion when she was a baby. Seems to be something that could happen if there was a bishop around, probably, which there most certainly would have been for Elizabeth I. She was confirmed and given communion at 3 days old, according to the record. Now, the Western Church, you remember I said the scholastics were arguing about what Eucharist actually was and whether Jesus was actually present in it and all of the rest of it. We'll come back to that in a minute. Because of all of this scholastic discussion about what happened in the Eucharist, the Western Church became very anxious about giving communion to babies at baptism. They were scared that a little crumb or drop might be profaned when it was dropped or when it was spilled. So usually what would happen was that the priest would dip his finger into the chalice and then place his finger onto the child's lips. By 1100, the church began to teach that Christ was fully present in the bread and in the wine, and people started to get worried about spilling the wine in a universal distribution of the wine to everybody. So people started just taking the bread, a practice that was common in the Roman Church until very, very recently. And you can see from everything that I've said that giving communion to children, to babies, is a long, long tradition in the Christian Church. It lasted for about 1,000 years. And so our great arguments about whether or not, children should be baptized at all, let alone given communion, would not really have been understood by these earliest Christians, who were quite happy to give the child communion immediately following on the baby's baptism. Here's another point. Saint Augustine of Hippo taught how important baptism was in cancelling the guilt of original sin. He was a big teacher on original sin. So the baptism of babies won the day. In the fragile world of the Middle Ages, nobody was going to wait until Easter or Pentecost to baptize their baby if that baby had been born in, say, May of the previous year. They'd have to wait a year for baptism, and literally God knows what would have happened to them given the fragility of life in the Middle Ages. And because, according to St. Augustine, we're all born with original sin and baptism gets rid of your original sin, what caring, loving parent on earth would run the risk of leaving their baby unbaptized for an entire risky year? So, baptism therefore began to happen 8 days after birth, and that was going to assure the salvation of the infant. Confirmation then had to come later when the bishop got round to it. But people began to say, what's confirmation for? What's the point of it when your child is already saved? It was a sort of famous question it was one that was asked on my general ordination exam. Confirmation, a rite in search of a meaning. Discuss. And indeed, in some ways it is. So even in the medieval period, people said, well, it sort of confirmed what happened at your baptism. It strengthened your baptism in some way. It does something. We're not exactly quite sure what, but the bishop has to do it. So you can see that the West paid a big price, first of all, for associating original sin with baptism, which the East never really did, and secondly, in splitting off the rite of baptism itself from the rite of anointing with oil and first communion. They also split it off from the seasons of Easter and Pentecost, because they wanted to rush their babies through as fast as possible in case they died before they were baptized. So we can see that dogma here, church dogma, has this really interesting impact on the liturgy of the church, and sometimes a very detrimental impact on the liturgy and worship of the church. If dogma dictates liturgy, we've put the cart before the horse. That's a bit of an Anglican thing to say, but in this particular case you can see that that's exactly what's gone on. The font, the baptismal font, here we go, it's a bit of a grainy picture, but never mind. It was often set just inside the main entrance of the church. You can still see that in many churches. Sometimes the baptistry is completely separate from the main body of the church. Sometimes the baptistry is a different building, like in the Cathedral, the Duomo in Florence. The baptistry is outside the church, so you had to get baptized before you went into it. So the porch of the church could be used for the first part of the rite, the exorcism, the promises, and all of the rest of it, before the baby was actually brought inside the door of the church to be baptized at the font, which was located near the entrance. The fonts are the size they are in churches. You might have often wondered why. Here's a couple of beautiful ones. Why are they this size? They are bigger in some places, but very seldom smaller. Well, they're the size of a baby. That's why they're this size, because the baby was completely immersed at this particular period. They were built this way to enable the full immersion of the baby. They were often about 2 feet in diameter, about 1 foot in depth, and here are a couple of examples of them. As you can see, here's the baptism of Jesus, I believe. Very often these fonts were 8-sided too, so you had a depiction of each of the sacraments on one of them, and then on the final side of the 8-sided font you would have a picture of the crucifixion, still showing the connection between baptism and rebirth through the cross and resurrection, death and resurrection. So the study of fonts is a really interesting thing to look at. So in a world where society and church were becoming pretty much the same thing, baptism tended to lose this earlier association that we saw on joining a community of faith. You were born into it. And what's the result of this? More stress, in the West at least, is going to be placed on the individual's salvation, rather than welcome to the Christian community through this act of baptism where we belong in the family of God. It's all about getting rid of that original sin, individual salvation, and baptism has lost this communitarian association with joining the family of God, which luckily now it's beginning to recapture, to bring back. Let's think for a minute then about daily prayer. As we already mentioned, monastic orders led the way in this field in both East and in West. In the West, though, daily prayer was monasticized. And even these little parish churches developed these long monastic chancels with stalls on either side of a central aisle to facilitate this antiphonal chanting of the Psalms. Remember that picture of Salisbury Cathedral? Well, you could imagine in Salisbury Cathedral there'd be a ton of monks knocking around. There was a monastery attached to it. But in these tiny little parish churches here, I've just chosen 2 at random, these parish churches are rural parish churches in England. There was no huge monastery attached to these things, and yet you've got these huge long chancels before you get to the altar. Sorry, this one on the left is undergoing renovation, but it still at least gives you an illustration, either that or it's a very messy Lent. It gives you an idea of how long these chancels are, and a group of people would gather together in these things to try and imitate the monks when they were ordained priests, or deacons or what have you, chanting the Psalms antiphonally crosswise. And now, in modern times, these tiny little churches don't even have choirs that can fill up this space. So very often the congregation comes and sits up there now, and this association with monastic antiphonal chanting has been lost, but the architecture of the churches obviously has been handed down to us for these reasons from earlier generations. So this daily prayer slowly developed into a sort of professional responsibility. It was done for the people, by monks, by clerics, and not done to bring all of the laity involved in it. The order of prayer that we looked at last week, the hours of prayer that we looked at then, people tried to keep those up in little parish churches, but obviously the laity had got much more pressing matters on hand, bringing the harvest in, or making baskets or pots, or trading, or doing whatever it was that they were doing. So it suddenly became professionalized, done by clerics and monks for the people. Ideally, it was going to be sung to Gregorian chant, either responsorial or with little antiphons. We'll look at that in a second, that were repeated in a slightly more elaborate tone at the beginning and the end of these psalms. So these are the sort of books that would be used here on the left and the right. The psalm would be sung responsorially, that is left and right, in that chancel arrangement that we just saw. The verses would be chanted by either side on a particular tone. One particular verse of Cynthia probably knows a lot more about this than I do, and I think we're going to do a special session on music, and it would be lovely to invite Cynthia to do a presentation for us in that as well. That what we've got here is the psalm that runs its little course, and then at the end at a certain point in the psalm, there's an antiphon, the same verse repeated in a slightly more elaborate tone, and people would have to learn these tones to be able to do it. Special liturgies were used for saints' days, for instance, and what you can see here is examples of the sort of the amount of books you needed in the medieval period to do anything. Different psalms, different Bible readings for saints' days or ordinary days. So by the end of our medieval period, Cranmer said famously, it took longer to find out what should be read than to read it when it was found out. So it's a bit like us scrambling through the back of the Book of the Common Prayer, saying what's the psalm set for the day, what's the reading set for the day. But it was far more complicated than that. On your left there, you can see a homilarium, I think they're called. This is a book that was full of sermons. On the right, you've got a special list of saints' days. That was in a separate book that would go for each day of the year. Then you had a mass book. Then you had an ordo, which was to tell you exactly what to do when. So you had to have this massive library of books to do a pretty straightforward morning or evening prayer, let alone a morning or evening prayer for a saint's day, let alone a mass for a saint's day, which involved even more books and fiddling about. But, interestingly enough, the advent of these mendicant orders, remember we talked about them, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, that would go around from place to place. They weren't necessarily stuck in a monastery. They weren't going to be carrying 15 books around with them wherever they went when they moved from town to town or village to village. This suddenly necessitated a single book so that it could be carried around by the Franciscans or the Dominicans. Otherwise, they would have needed a psalter, they would have needed an antiphonary, they would have needed a martyrology, telling you which saint of the day, a homilary, and something called a collector, a way of synthesizing these pieces together so that they can be done in the right order. So this single book became known as a breviary. That's where we get the breviary from. And as you can see here, this is an elaborate one, but it enabled the user of this breviary just to privatize now, because there's one book, to privatize what had been a sort of corporate and usually a sung form of worship by a bunch of clerics getting together in these churches. So the invention of these monastic orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, gave rise to the privatization of what had hitherto been something that was done by a professional class. Not that the Dominicans and the Franciscans weren't professional.
Nigel?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt,
No,
but
please
your
do.
previous picture, if you notice, the book on the right has a stick, and it was tradition to never allow anyone to touch these books with their hands because the oils would ruin these precious original books. So it was tradition to turn it with a stick, only with a stick.
Yeah, I'm
Not
wondering
with your hands.
if that thing I thought was a conducting stick.
It looks like, yes.
Where was it? It was back here somewhere, wasn't it?
Well, you had it before the.
Did I? Oh,
before the
this,
fancy-
you see. Is
Oh,
that
yes.
the thing to turn pages, or is he
It's
telling
to
them
turn
how to sing?
pages. The conductor's stick was quite a late invention. In fact, at this time, everyone that did lead with their hands, or conducted, if you will, would have actually only used the circular motion, which was like the symbol of the host.
Oh, I see. Yes.
So that would have definitely been a stick to turn the pages, because since they didn't have, as you said, printing presses, the oils on your hands would really ruin the beautiful, elaborate ink.
Yeah. Shoris told me something interesting the other day, looking at our books of common prayer, which are getting a little greasy on the outside of the part of the book that you can see. Wait a minute. Where are we? Here. And he said, well, they were gilded not just because it was fancy, but because it repelled the grease of the hand that was turning it.
Oh, there you go.
I never realised that before. It was interesting. Let's think for a minute about the Eucharist. Oops. There's a breviary. Here's another breviary. Sometimes they weren't that elaborate. See how much more simple this is. And here is a very simple breviary indeed. You've got the tune on the right-hand side, and then you've got your readings and what have you here, so that you can easily turn to the page that you want and get everything in a brief form, instead of having to juggle with 15 different books. Holy Communion. This is a disco Jesus. The Eucharist was the most common form of public worship that people attended on Sundays and on lots of saints' days. 2 books were used for this purpose. A book that was a collection of what we'd call service sheets or bulletins, and it contained the priest's prayers, it contained the readings for Sundays and feast days, it contained some songs. There are lots of different collections of these books. The other book was the Ordo, and that gave priests directions on how to perform services, when to stand up, where to walk, how many candles you needed, what to do with the incense, all of those little details. These were not printed in the service sheets, it was a separate book that was used. Now, as time went on, the Mass became more and more remote to the lay people who were attending it. So the altar table receded further and further away from view until it ended up stuck against the east wall of the church. And now the priest is going to have his back turned to the people. And the chief action that a lay person would be able to observe through the screen that separated the lay people from the priest and the priest's entourage, the chief action that they would able to see was the elevation of the host. And seeing this moment became the high point of the Mass. People even used to shout out, it's recorded, lift it higher, priest, if they couldn't see the host, because they thought they'd been cheated of their communion if they couldn't see it. So they would interrupt the priest at this moment and say, lift it higher so we can get a good look at it. The Mass was also held in Latin. You can see here these candles. You've got one candle on the altar, but at the elevation of the host here, the deacon assistant would kneel down, make sure that the chasuble wasn't caught in anything by holding it behind, and lift up these two candles when the host was there, sometimes called candles of elevation. They're not really used anymore. The service was also held in Latin, which must have made it seem even more remote to the laity, and the central prayer of thanksgiving, when it came to the thanksgiving prayer of the Mass, the ordo tells the priest to do it in a low and quiet voice, so people couldn't hear it. What they could hear when the priest began to speak was "Hoc est corpus meum," "This is my body," which the ordo instructs it to be said in a louder voice, which gave rise to that expression "hocus pocus," meaning a lot of nonsense that nobody really understands. So it was very difficult for people to hear, even if they did speak Latin and were standing quite close, because the priest was supposed to say some of these words of institution very quietly. Also at this period, these private masses developed, special masses held for the repose of the souls of the dead in these chantry chapels. Here you can see an example of this chantry chapel, where there would be one priest celebrating communion around the grave of a wealthy benefactor for the repose of the soul of the dead. Other people were not invited to join into these things. So for a lot of reasons, most people ceased to receive communion very frequently. In fact, even devout people ended up taking communion just 4 times a year. We often associate that with the Protestant tradition, but actually it's a medieval tradition too, that even if you were a very devout person, you would take communion just these 4 times a year, at Christmas, at Easter, at Pentecost, and probably at the patronal festival of your parish. So if your patron saint was Francis of Assisi, you would take communion on Francis of Assisi Day, on the 4th of October, what have you. Now, because of all of these developments, the participation of the... Here's another chantry chapel. This one is in Christchurch, Oxford, the cathedral there. Participation of the laity, then, what were they supposed to do when all of this thing was going on? Well, it became understood mostly in visual terms. What can you see? Now, mostly nowadays we equate participation with hearing something, or understanding something, or responding to something in words especially. You're not participating if you don't sing or respond, or if you can't hear. But for medieval people, there were actions that you performed, like standing up for the gospel, kneeling for the consecration prayer, looking up at the elevated host, and all of these actions gave them some sort of connection to what the priest was doing. But there was also lots of things to see for people in the nave. We know this about medieval cathedrals, for instance. There were paintings, there was stained glass, there were sculptures on the walls, and under their feet were the images of the deceased on the floor. Those great brasses or sculptures of the deceased that were buried underneath the church floor, so that they could participate in the Mass in the way that we saw the early Christians bringing in the coffin to the communal meal of the martyr. So the whole building became a visual communication, a visual communion. The whole building became this sort of textbook of the saints of the past. And if you looked up at the great rood screen that separated the chancel from the nave, the people's part of the church from the clerics' part of the church, there were scenes of the Last Judgment, for instance. So the church didn't just contain a textbook of the saints of the past, it also contained warnings about the future. So it brought you into the church in this way that suspended you in this liturgical time through all of the images that you saw around you.
Very three-dimensional
Yes.
experience.
Very three-dimensional experience and not flat as we've come to understand it now, that our worship can sometimes be today.
What I found interesting in what you're saying, Nigel, is that it seems that the interaction, the participation, is not an interaction so much as it is today.
Yes.
There's a form of participating that's more holistic, because it's not only a response to what you see, because sometimes you don't see well. It's not only a response to what you hear.
Because you can't hear.
Oh, you can't hear. But that will be through a lot of different signs that you can see through the sanctuary.
Yes.
So it's more multidimensional. It's not just back and forth like we're doing it.
Responses and what have you, like we do it today sometimes. It's more multidimensional, like you said.
What I found interesting also in what you're saying is that when the liturgy is done behind, so it's almost not seen, which is pretty much like the Eastern Orthodox today, so that you don't see whole of it, but you kind of see it. It's also putting the faithful in the situation of faith that sometimes you see, sometimes you don't see. There's a real existential dimension to this mysterious unveiling and revealing.
Yes, it's not all done out in the open, and faith is a belief in what you cannot see, in the hope of what has not yet been.
It's holding both together.
Yeah, and that liturgy perhaps expresses it better than maybe we can do now. So not only did the people participate in this very three-dimensional way, they could also occupy themselves with things like devotions inside the church. They could be little prayers that they'd learned by heart. It might be the rosary, or the use of beads, as we can see here in this medieval prayer book on the left. There may be, and this is important, penitential rites that they would go through, asking God's forgiveness or expressing their unworthiness. So it's not as if they're not doing anything and complaining that they can't see and they can't hear. They're engaged in all sorts of acts of private devotion, together with looking around the church and experiencing the Mass in that way. This sort of introspective or subjective piety of penitence became very characteristic of Western Eucharistic piety. I'm not worthy to receive you, but speak the word only and I shall be healed. This connection between being worthy to receive communion and penitence is a very Western emphasis. What do you get in the Eastern Church instead? An emphasis on adoration and awe before God. It's not to say that the penitence isn't there, it is, but it's less individualistic. And this individualism and the emphasis on individual sin, and as we talked about with baptism, and their penitential rites when they went into the church, this focus of the priest saying the Mass is the most sacred thing, you can't take it in an unworthy way. This tended to put the emphasis on penitence and individual piety instead of a whole group of people falling on their faces in adoration and awe before God, represented in those great icons of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and which is characteristic of Eastern Orthodox worship even today. Now, what did they think communion was? We tend to think that these great arguments about transubstantiation and what have you are very modern. But actually in the 700s there was a dispute about whether the communicant actually received the actual body and blood of Christ, or was it a symbol? The great place of dispute was l'Abbé de Corbie. You know this place? I think it's in South...
Corbeil.
Corbeil.
Is it Corbeil?
Oui, Corbeil.
Corbie.
Corbie. Two monks got together there. One said it's symbolic, and the other said no, it's actually the body and blood of Christ. There was lots of arguing back and forth. Eventually, this idea that yes, indeed, it was the body and blood of Christ prevailed, and the idea of transubstantiation came about only in the 12th century, in the 1100s. So basically 500 years into our particular period. So that after 1,000 Christian years, without any specific term for what the priest and people were actually eating and drinking, this little word transubstantiation became the normative way for describing it in the West. That hadn't been necessary before. For 1,000 years of church's history, they were thinking, let that be a mystery. And suddenly, in our period, we landed up with this clinical little word that's caused so much problem, even today, in the discussions between Reformed churches, Protestant churches, and Roman Catholic churches in particular. Also, in fact, what they came up with was something that sounded like philosophy. It took on Aristotle and all of the rest of it. And quite frankly, what the laity continued to prefer was these miraculous explanations of what they were consuming. They wanted stories, like this one, for instance, the story of the bleeding host. The host was consecrated and bled, and people came to worship it in this monstrance, another product of the worship of vision, of seeing, rather than the worship of words and consuming. So they also told stories about, say, that when the host was taken outside, the donkeys would kneel because they reverenced the presence of Jesus, because the donkey had carried Jesus into Jerusalem. So donkeys were particularly prone to kneeling before the host. I think that's beautiful, and a real integration of nature and worship and adoration. And I much prefer it to abstract discussions of transubstantiation, and so did most lay people of the day. Now, the construction of a Gothic cathedral was an act of faith in itself. There's a profound spirituality involved in writing an icon, say, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, as Nita knows and will come back to. This is an act of worship. Patrick, did you want to say something? No, you're all right. That's fine. The act of producing the icon itself, of writing the icon itself, is an act of worship, is a liturgy in itself. And the construction of a Gothic cathedral was a liturgy and an act of worship in and of itself. It's the way that the community set about designing and constructing a cathedral. I wanted to talk about that just for a minute, because these medieval cathedrals are perhaps something that they're one of the most powerful things that they've bequeathed to us in terms of liturgy and worship of the time. The site itself would be chosen on a variety of criteria. Where were you going to build it? The sacredness of the place itself was very important. Was it an important Roman town or an important trading route? If so, there was likely to be a cathedral church there as the main church of an administrative diocese. Secondly, was this site famous for a particular saint or a particular relic? Notre Dame at Le Follegue, Notre Dame de la Follegue in Brittany, that's a picture you've got here in front of you. It's said to occupy the place where this holy fool had his chapel. He lived in the open air. He disciplined himself by sitting naked in a cold spring. He sang Breton tunes to honour the Virgin, and he repeated constantly the words Ave Maria, as a mantra. And when he died, a lily was found growing out of his grave, with the words Ave Maria printed on its petals. And when his tomb was reopened, because he was considered a holy man, it was found that this flower was growing from his mouth. And so a cathedral was founded in that place because it was the centre of devotion to this particular holy person. So foundations like these, there's a little picture of the chap hanging from the tree. I couldn't remember quite what the story was attached to that in his little sabot. And here is the stained glass window conjuring up the same image, mais sans sabot. So foundations like this show that actually medieval piety refused to be limited by the powerful church officials who said, no, it's got to be the centre of the Roman administration where this is going to be, our big cathedral is going to be placed right here in the centre of power. No, very often cathedrals and important churches were put in places that were associated with local saints who certainly were far away from the administration's view of power. Now, was this a particular site associated with the pagan people who'd lived there before, before the arrival of Christianity? And we saw examples of this when we looked at Celtic spirituality and the labyrinth in these high Gothic cathedrals in the Ile-de-France and elsewhere. Sites of holy wells, for instance, were particularly venerated, like St. Winifred's Well in Cheshire in the UK, or St. Bridget's Well in Kildare in Ireland. So places associated with miraculous wells, with the pagan people, holy places, groves of trees, labyrinths that predated the foundations of these cathedrals. People would build them in these sacred spaces too. So they weren't just built in random places or places that were associated with imperial or church power. Now, a lot of cathedrals are built on sites that combine both of these things. They're built to be an expression of God's presence on earth through the authority of an administrative diocese, say, and God's presence on earth in particularly holy people or through particularly holy places. Now, once you'd commissioned a cathedral, you had to find the raw material to build it with. There's a holy well. I think this one is in France. I can't remember where. You can see it springing up down here, and a cathedral has been built around it, and the holy well is used for the baptisms. Not sure why I've got that there. You had to find the material to build your cathedral with. This is a medieval quarry, which is why it looks terribly regular there. The sandstone it appears to be sandstone, has been cut out. The local nobility would often give a site like this to the church to be the quarry for these places to be built. It was necessary then to find the masons, the experts in the crafts of stained glass, in woodwork, to construct these things. These powerful lords, as I said, gave right to quarries or the right to a forest, especially for the building of the cathedral. They would do this to expiate their sins as a way of worship or liturgy in itself. They would do it to encourage the piety of the local population. And say, oh, the Lord has given that great stone work up there for the construction of a cathedral. How blessed we are to have this. And the local population was also involved in the work. Now, they might not have been skilled at the crafts that were necessary to construct a complicated building like this. This was in the hand of experts who dedicated their lives prayerfully to that purpose. But there was more than enough work to go round for them. They could bake bread for the workers. They could transport heavy rocks. They could volunteer their carts or their agricultural tools for the construction efforts. There are some fascinating pictures of this indeed. This is in Schart Cathedral. This is the Guild of the Bread Bakers, who bake the bread for the workers on the cathedral. There was also, I believe right here, and obviously for the communion too. That's an interesting connection, isn't it? The same bread that might have been used to feed the people was also the bread that were building the cathedral, was used for the communion services at the end of the day. Here you have people, coopers and wheelwrights, who were using their skills in order to contribute to the building of the cathedral. These wheels were extremely important. These barrels, the coopers they were called, were also important in the transport of sand, of raw materials that you'd need for your cathedral. Here you can see people, ordinary people, just bringing along stones. These are not expert construction people. It's the local population involved in this act of worship at the building of a medieval cathedral, with all of these bits and pieces and tools, like the wheelwright has been involved. They said, old Loic from down the road has big feet and strong legs. Let's put him in the wheel to winch up the stones to get them to form the cathedral walls. But we have this cult of the carts and what have you. Now, once the cathedral had been built, it was necessary to dedicate it. Here we have the cult of the carts again, I think, and here's the Virgin Mary of Schart.
I guess this type of building was also applicable for smaller churches too.
Yes, yeah, it wouldn't just be the big cathedrals. Yeah, a small church in your own. We often associate this now with Jehovah's Witnesses, don't we? Because they get together and build their own churches themselves, maybe under the instruction of somebody who's got some skill in it, but they believe it's really an act of worship to come together to build their own place of worship. And that must have been true for those small parish churches. Yeah.
What I find interesting is that sometimes on medieval illuminations, you see like the Temple of Salomon is represented as a Gothic temple. Yeah. Yeah. And so you have the connection that they're building a kind of a new temple too, when they're building this together, like the people of Israel.
The heaven comes to earth. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, in the very early medieval period, here you've got, this is a castle in the south of France. They've decided to reconstruct it using only medieval methods, and I can't remember where this is now. But Dordogne. And they discovered that it was actually a lot more complicated and a lot more effort than they thought it was, and involved a lot more people than they thought it was going to involve. But it was an interesting experiment. I think it's finished now, but it took a lot longer. So. It's not finished?
I think they always want to make more.
They want to keep building it?
I don't think it's finished.
Interesting to look up. So these cathedrals, as we were just saying, heaven comes to earth and earth comes to heaven. How blessed is this place? The Lord was here and I did not know it. This is the vision of Jacob and Jacob's ladder. You have a ladder being used on this sign, the local king blessing the business. All right. In the earliest period, the ceremony of dedicating a cathedral or blessing a cathedral involved, or setting it aside for divine worship, it would consist just of the celebration of the Mass and the installation of the holy relics in various altars, which would be brought in procession. But by the time of the Gothic period, the ceremony had become much, much more elaborate. Very interesting, actually, about this three-dimensional aspect of worship. The way in which a church or a cathedral was dedicated really expresses this. The Bible was used as a precedent. So the story of Jacob at Bethel, here in Genesis 28, surely the Lord is in this place. Jacob took the stone which he had used as a pillow, and set it up as a pillar for the house of God, and he poured oil on it, says the Bible. So, here are the medieval Christians looking through the Bible for a precedent. What are they going to do with the oil? the dedication of Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 8. It says, "But will God dwell on earth?" I think this is Solomon and the building of the temple. "Will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain thee. How much less this house which I have built?" So the king then prays for remission of offences, release from captivity, relief from drought and famine, victory in battle, asking that any prayer that was addressed in this new cathedral should be answered. That was the role of the patron in this business. Now, what would happen next? This is where it starts to get very interesting. The bishop who's doing the consecration is going to process 3 times around the cathedral in full vestments outside it. He hasn't gone in yet. He's going to be accompanied by a host of these vested priests and monks. And the bishop going round sprinkles it first at ground level with holy water, then at waist level with holy water, and then at head level with holy water. And Yves of Schart, he interpreted this aspersion of the building from the outside as a parallel to this triple immersion of baptism, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. It's almost as if they're performing a baptism on the building before they're allowed to go in it. Now, each time the bishop passes in front of the great western door, the main entrance to the cathedral, he's going to strike it with his crozier, this hooked stick that he carries, and he shouts in a loud voice, "Lift up your gates, ye princes, and be lifted up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in." He's not referring to himself, he's referring to the entrance of Christ for the first time into the building. There's a deacon on the other side of the door who's been allowed into the building, and he replies each time, "Who is the King of glory?" And the bishop answers, "The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle." And this was supposed to dedicate the church as a sort of fortress that God was about to storm, to rush into and take under God's command. After this 3 times around the cathedral, the bishops and the attendants enter into the cathedral and they leave the congregation outside. Here we've got some idea of what's going on. And the bishop is going to take his crozier. We've got 2 bishops, actually got 4 of them here. There's 2 here and 2 here. The bishop takes the crozier and traces the Greek alphabet diagonally across the nave in these ashes that have been previously spread across the floor, and then diagonally the other way writes the Latin alphabet, crossing over the Greek alphabet, which comes first. And this was taken to symbolize the education, the catechumenate of the cathedral. The cathedral is being taught through this act. It's supposed to represent this instruction that was given to Christians before they were baptized. The door of the church itself was sprinkled with this specially concocted holy water, and all of the ingredients of this holy water were allegorized. So you would have rue, for instance, a bitter herb that was supposed to symbolize suffering, because suffering people would enter through the doors. Perfumed oil was put in there, the perfumed oil of paradise, because eventually the door would become the very door to paradise. Now, once this education of the building was finished, the bishop and the dignitaries and the people would process into the church, carrying the holy relics up to the altar. 12 consecration crosses. It's a little bishop doing some education, and there's the heads of 2 croziers, you see, from the medieval period that might have been used for this very rite in some of these churches. Very often you can see on these medieval cathedrals these crosses. And you think, well, why is there a cross there? There's clearly no altar or anything. It doesn't seem to be related to anything at all. These are called Consecration Crosses. They've been previously inscribed, sometimes quite roughly, into the church walls. Each of these 12 consecration crosses was anointed with oil. And at each anointing, the bishop would say, "Let this temple be sanctified and consecrated." There's one item missing. How are we going to consecrate the altar in particular? Well, that changes from church to church. Sometimes the altar was consecrated with a funeral-like ritual, where songs that you would sing at a person's funeral were celebrated, because, in fact, the altar was the resting place of a saint's relics. Sometimes it was consecrated with a rite borrowed from the rituals of baptism and confirmation. In other words, that particular part of the church was anointed with the oil of exorcism to drive out any demons that might be here. I'll come back to that in a second. And the altar was then said to be baptized and confirmed, anointing it with the holy oil that you would use to baptize and confirm a person. Here's another consecration cross inscribed into the wall of a cathedral. There's even a record of a ritual exorcism being performed at church consecrations. A deacon was dressed up as a demon who was the other side of the door, saying, "Who is the King of Glory? Who is the King of Glory?" And as soon as the doors burst open and the bishop claimed possession of the building, the deacon had to run away. That's rather nice.
We should do that with the consecration of the living church.
Yes, maybe our new elevator could be consecrated in a similar sort of way. That's a very good idea. We're going to be looking around for volunteer to dress up as a demon. The celebration of Mass. So this is the Sainte-Chapelle. We heard when we did the course on Christian architecture that these high Gothic cathedrals in the Ile-de-France evoked the presence of God most effectively by the use of light. And anybody who entered one of these cathedrals would be immediately sort of impressed with the way that the light would be suffused with this divine light that communicated a sort of power. This Sainte-Chapelle, built in the 1240s as a royal chapel in the house of several relics, including the crown of thorns, obviously, it gives you an idea of how light was manipulated in these buildings in order to express awe and the presence of God. What had been in Romanesque churches, this sort of tiered place where people sat at the front of the church, has now been completely replaced by a high altar that's been installed against the back wall of the church. This is a rood screen, and here's the altar behind it. The bishop and the assisting clergy now sat to one side of the altar rather than in a hoop on arranged seating around the back of it. The last little idea that we got that the table was a place of communal feasting with people seated behind it. All of a sudden, in this medieval period, that seating arrangement was replaced by sedias to either side of the altar. So it looked like they were presiding at a rite and not presiding at a meal. So the altar and the choir formed this chancel, as we saw before, the place where only the clergy and the religious were allowed. The chancel sometimes separated from the nave of the church, the main body of the church, by this rood screen, this elaborately carved barrier that divided the spaces. So as I've said, an ordinary worshipper would only be able to see the Mass, what is going on up here, the elevation, as we can see here. I rather like this picture with these faces peering over at this moment. Maybe one of them is saying, "Lift it higher, priest." Elaborate curtains would shelter it off too from the people. Here again you can see these sanctuary curtains coming around and about. We've got two monks assisting the priest in the elevation of the bleeding host, here with two candles on the altar. Sometimes a pillar got in people's way, so they couldn't see the elevation of the host. They would then look through these squints, they were called, or sometimes called hagioscope. And in some churches, the altar was further screened by these heavy curtains. Why did they do this? People have said, well, it was to protect the priests against the draft, because these churches were very drafty places, so they hung up these curtains to keep everybody warm. Well, if you're dressed in several layers of velvet and silk and gold embroidery, that's the last of your concerns, basically. Was it done to emphasize the exclusivity of clerical power? So only those people who were allowed to be in the proximity of the consecration of the host were allowed to be there. Everybody else was excluded. Was it done to augment the spiritual power of this enclosed space? That the sacredness of the space wasn't to be desecrated even by the gaze, much less the presence of uninitiated lay people. Their gaze could contaminate the holiness of what was going on. But you see, this redesign also corresponded to this new theology of the Mass, which focused less on this shared community of the congregational meal and more on the sacrifice of Christ and the miracle of transubstantiation. That's basically what's going on here. Christ himself becomes immolated on the altar of the parish church. Body, soul, divinity. As we saw in that little picture of Jesus dancing on the altar a little earlier on.
What I find interesting what you're saying is that it's also very typological, like it's always relating to biblical text and Old Testament texts, which are all about the sanctuary. And with these curtains, it's reminding of like the Temple of Salomon and how you can, but because the curtain is rent.
Yes, torn in two.
Yes. You can kind of see it now.
Yes, yeah. That's interesting. Yes, but it's here the curtain is open and closed at the same time. Yeah. Here are a few of these squints in various different churches. You can see when you look through them, you can immediately see the altar on the other side of it. They've been purposefully placed in this really interesting way about the sacredness of seeing the elevation of the host. Interesting parallels to our own time. Maybe that is what the communion looks like for some of us through the camera lens. Not eating it, but participating in it through looking. Yeah, we're back to the medieval period. Here's another one, straight up to the high altar. It must have been very powerful seeing it through that sort of enclosed hole in some way, catching a glimpse of heaven through the hole. Like the camera lens. And here's two more. This is a really powerful one. You can see right up to the centre of the high altar here. And here somebody's put a little cyclamen in to make it look a bit more jolly. Sometimes they were pierced in the outside wall of the church, so lepers and people with skin diseases could also take part in the ceremony by looking in from the outside.
I think there are also typological meaning to that, like the dove in the crack of the wall and all of this type of association with like the importance of like holes in the stone.
Yes, yeah. Rock of Ages.
Yeah.
Even before the Mass began, the priest would begin with this sort of ritual vesting in these elaborate copes that emphasized their spiritual power, their authority, and about what they were about to do. A bell would ring, and the host was raised at the climax of the Mass, and the congregants would sort of rouse themselves from whatever it was that they were doing, and they'd crane their necks for a glimpse of the host. And as I've said, lay people are going to commune through looking rather than through eating. This was a really powerful thing in the Middle Ages too. So why people went on pilgrimages to gaze on various relics, to be in the presence of those relics. People thought the action of looking was a more sacred and holy thing. Light, after all, was created before animals or plants that you could taste. What you can see, therefore, light, is more holy than what you can eat. This was an idea that came about during this particular time, and that there was a belief that the eye sent out rays that actually touched things in order for you to be able to see. So seeing was a form of touching, essentially. And when they talked about the vice of envy and all of the rest of it, we can see in some cultures that the eye that wards off evil and all of the rest of it comes from the same sort of idea.
It's where you say like someone's look has stabbed you.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? He pierced me with his look. Yeah. The Eucharistic Host would often be kept in a dove or a pyx, and it could be adored at a distance by the worshippers in the cathedral, because it would be flying above in these beautifully forged pyxes in the shape of a dove. You'd be able to open the bird up here at the back and place the consecrated host inside. There are many beautiful examples of this in many churches. They're not so much used today, perhaps. People tend to put them in a little box at the back of the thing. I prefer this way of doing it, to be honest. Yes, yeah, the aumbrey. Here the aumbrys and saints' relics would sometimes be kept in here, but also the consecrated host for representing the presence of Christ in these places. I'm quite sure what I'm doing here. The sculptural work inside these Gothic cathedrals was supposed to be inspiring, yes, indeed, immersive, 100%, but also instructive. The royal portal at Schart is a very famous example of this. Oh, here's the procession of the host under these baldachins where the host is taken outside. We discovered that in our spirituality course that it was medieval women who invented this rite. It didn't get invented by the bishops. The women said we need a means of adoration of the host that isn't just going to happen if we happen to be in church at the time of the elevation. And so they petitioned the church to invent a new rite, and Corpus Christi is a result of, once again, liturgy springing from the people's need and not springing from the bishop's decrees.
And getting outside the church.
Getting outside the church, yes, in, I think, all of these examples of that, aren't they? Yeah, this is probably another one. Here's the royal portal at Schart. It's this example of high Gothic sculpture that depicts the kings and queens of the New Testament, of the Old Testament. They're very sort of columnar, aren't they? So they're very serene and elongated. It's almost as if they're floating and not standing. They're midway between heaven and earth. They exist in this sort of spiritual bliss on their own, as if they're floating above. But the figures of the south portal, they're dedicated to the time before Christ, especially to Mary. I don't know if I've got. Oh no, I don't have pictures of those. They look as if they're relating to each other a little bit more, and you can sometimes tell who they are by what's under their feet. Also in these medieval cathedrals there would be depictions of the seasons, for instance, of the year, the agricultural year, signs of the zodiac. Very often the cathedrals themselves were arranged in such a way that evoked the orientation of the cathedral. In other words, the cathedral would face east, so the high altar was facing east to the rising sun. The left of the church, therefore, is going to be more north-facing, at least in well, it depends on which hemisphere that you're in at all. But in the northern hemisphere, it's the side of the church that receives less light. So therefore, you're going to put pictures from the Old Testament on the left-hand side of the church. And on the right-hand side of the church, you're going to put pictures from the New Testament, because here the light facing south streams in. And on the great west portal, in the direction of the setting of the sun, over the great door, you're going to put a depiction of the Last Judgment, of the last things. So even the way the cathedral is orientated in its space is a means of education, of immersing people into this liturgical, worshipful experience. I think that is all I have got, or all I had time to do. As I've said, it's a vast, vast subject. Here are a few questions that come to mind. I didn't have time to type them up, so we're just going to have to hear. We discovered that prayer in this particular period became a profession of the bishops, the priests, the deacons. It became monasticized and rather complicated and elaborate. You'd have to have the right books and know where to look and stick it all together. How much training do we think a worship leader needs? Is it something that, especially morning and evening prayer, as we've seen at Saint-Esprit while I was away and on other occasions too, we can see that if you know where to look and where to get what you need and more or less follow the rubrics, the process has been simplified so that lay people can do that. So perhaps a worship leader doesn't need quite as much training as we think. And if we make it, you can only do it if you've been really properly trained and told exactly what to do and where to do it. We're running the same risk as the medieval church ran, and we're professionalizing the liturgy that belongs to everybody. That's the work of all of the people. Well, time's drawn on. It's 8:45. I think we should close with a prayer. Thank you, everybody. But a little moment of silence and then the prayer.
Manifeste ta présence, Dieu de miséricorde, et protège-nous durant les heures de la nuit, pour qu'au milieu des changements de cette vie, nous puissions nous reposer sur toi qui ne change jamais. Regarde de ton trône céleste, Dieu Tout-Puissant, et de la lumière de ton ciel éclaire cette nuit. Que de nuit comme de jour, ton peuple glorifie ton saint nom. Par Jésus le Christ, notre Seigneur. Amen.
Amen.
Bénissons le Seigneur.
Nous rendons grâce à Dieu. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, and sleep well.
Sleep well.
Good night, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.